TV recording. Apologies for the delay, but we do have a quorum. We have Joel and Kurt online right at the moment. So we're going to start off today. Welcome to the August 15th, 2022 Grants Pass City Council Workshop. And first up, we are interviewing a candidate for our Historical Building and Sites Commission. And welcome, Kathy Ford Johnson is here to interview with us. If you could please stand up here at this podium and make sure that the microphone is on. It's right at the base of the microphone. There's a button.
Testing.
Awesome, thank you. Welcome. Please, I have a few questions here, and so our process today, just to give you a little bit of an overview, we interview the candidate, and then we'll actually decide at a business meeting on a Wednesday evening who we're appointing, whether or not we make the appointment, and so we won't be making any decision today.
Thank you.
And then one way or another, we will let you know if you've been appointed.
Thank you.
So please just introduce yourself for a moment. Tell us who you are and why you are interested in joining the Hbsc.
Thank you. Is it morning? Yes, still morning for 2 minutes. Good morning. My name is Kathy Ford Johnson, and I'm interested in this appointment. A bit about my personal history. I was born and raised in Grants Pass. Lived in Grants Pass in the 60s and 70s, went to college in Ashland, came back, was hired at Grants Pass High School, taught at Grants Pass in District 7 for 4 years, and then I have moved around California and Oregon. I received my principal and superintendent credential. I served as administrator in various schools in Oregon for the last 19 years, and I just retired. I currently work at George Fox University overseeing the teaching program, and I was just hired by Oregon City as a consultant to do all their teacher observations for the coming year. I do maintain a residence in Grants Pass. I do own property on Southwest G Street with our family business, and I love Grants Pass. I think it's a wonderful place to raise children. I think it's a wonderful place to start a business. I think it's, I've seen a lot of changes from 6th and 7th Street loaded with log trucks in the 60s and 70s, thriving businesses in the timber industry. And like lots of Oregon cities, that went away, but I have seen Grants Pass be flexible and transition and turn it into a destination, a beautiful destination. I think a big piece of what is a draw for Grants Pass, when I talk to folks who visited here, or I've recommended that folks come here for vacationing, is the historical aspects of Grants Pass. It has deep and rich history, and the reason I'm interested in this position is because I would like to be a voice of the stakeholders, which would be the business owners as well as the patrons, as well as the citizens of Grants Pass. I think it's important not to have a personal agenda. I think it's important to be somebody that can be a voice for folks. And that's the purpose for my interest in this committee.
Thank you. Can you please describe the role of the Historic Building and Sites Commission and that of a commissioner?
Yes. I think it ties in very closely to the vision and mission that you have stated for your city. I think, as I mentioned previously, it's important to maintain the history of Grants Pass, to be able to do some research, to be able to validate your decisions. I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's very important to make connections with people, to have relationships with stakeholders, to be someone that they trust, to not be pushing your own agenda, and because I don't have one, other than I love Grants Pass, and I want to see it continue to move in the positive direction that I have witnessed myself. I think it's important to work collegially with the other individuals on the commission, and to constantly be flexible and to make a progression that is inclusive of the folks in Grants Pass. They deserve that, and I think the historical piece of Grants Pass is what its future could possibly surround about, so it's important to build upon that.
And what specific skills would you bring to the HBSC?
I'm a master. I do all the expulsion hearings in Oregon as well, so in Oregon City, I'm sorry. So I'm very good at listening. I'm good at, sometimes I'm able to, people will come to a meeting and they'll be just completely on one side, and I'm very good at kind of listening and able to reiterate where they're coming from and what other people, sometimes other voices aren't heard as much as they need to be heard. So I'm very good at that. I'm also very accountable. That's my strength also. And like I've mentioned now 3 times, I don't have a personal agenda other than my heart is here. I'm a 5th generation individual for Grants Pass. My brother and I own multiple properties, just one in the historical district, but so we're not going anywhere.
What do you see as important issues of preservation that will confront us in the next few years, and why are they important?
I think there's some specific issues. I know there are some vacancies within the historical district. I think it's important that those are filled with businesses that continue to draw individuals into Grants Pass. I think there's an issue with parking. I think there's an issue with lodging. I think we have a lot of strengths in that. I think it's important to maintain really good relationships with building owners, so that rather than pulling apart, we listen to them and we can be on the same page as well as far as a vision. G Street specifically, the right side as you're looking south, I guess that's owned by the Board Travis. He actually came to the task force and spoke earlier last week and had ideas. I think it's important to really listen to folks. That's what I think needs to happen. I think people really need to listen, make wise decisions. I was in Ashland the other day and I saw, I think it's called the Lark Hotel, which is right behind the Shakespearean Festival, that has the same footprint as this hotel on 6th Street. They're sisters. Okay, so I wasn't going nuts. And I can remember my grandmother telling me a story about her mother going to the top and watching for planes during the war. They would go up to, so there's some interesting history, but that's a beautiful building in the heart of Grants Pass. And there's so much possibility. I think it's important to look at other cities in the United States. We don't stand alone in this issue of trying to maintain history and do it correctly. But I've been to other cities on the East Coast that have done a beautiful job with parking structures and having kind of and even in Oregon, Lake Oswego, West Lynn. I was talking earlier about in North Carolina, one of my sons lives in Raleigh, and there's some beautiful towns in North Carolina that have revitalized. But if you make a mistake, it can be extremely costly, financially, to the pocketbook as well as to people's hearts and ability to make a living. So that's very important. Take your time and make wise decisions.
Brian.
Hi, thank you for applying.
Thank you.
I just had a few questions, and one was a follow-up to what Sarah just asked, but you mentioned issues around parking and lodging, and I know you mentioned the one building, but I'm just curious what you see as the issues surrounding the parking and lodging.
So, Councilor DeLaGrange, correct? Yes. I see there's not a lot of lodging in the center of town. There is lodging on the river, which is gorgeous, and there's some large lodging in the north area of town, but there's not a boutique hotel. There's not lodging around the center of of town. I had my secretary and her husband came down last summer, and they stayed above the old Owl Club, and they had a beautiful, beautiful apartment, and they loved it, and they loved walking the streets and shopping and going down G Street and having coffee in the morning. Other cities that are thriving, which this could, have lodging that's more walkable. Not that you can't walk from the river to downtown in 10 minutes. It's not that. And then parking, that's a long-range concern, depending on what would happen to the property on the right side of G Street. I don't know, this is just my own opinion. I think we're very fortunate to have that parking right there, but if that were to go away, that would be a concern.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I also was going to ask you how you see the relationship between historic preservation and economic development and tourism, and how those play with each other.
Well, they're very closely married, and I think it's important, again, to have that communication. I think Grants Pass has gone from a timber town, from what I have seen. There were many thriving mills back in the 60s and 70s. It seems like it has transitioned into tourism being its #1 industry. Am I wrong? Maybe? Maybe. Well, then I will continue on and say I think it should be. It definitely could be. I've heard people on, well, let me share this. When I'm on the East Coast and I say I'm from Southern Oregon, they will say, have you ever gone down the Rogue River in the jet boat trip? That's on the East Coast. People have said that. People in Portland are spending time in Grants Pass with their families versus staying in Portland. Portland's going in a direction that I don't see Grants Pass going in. And if I had little ones, I would definitely make sure they were raised here. I think tourism, I know a couple people who've visited and they have actually relocated, so they came here on a vacation. So tourism has brought some more folks actually moving in as residents and stakeholders. So it's very closely tied, those three things.
Great, thank you. And then you also mentioned, I think you mentioned you currently work for George Fox and that you're taking on a position for the Oregon City School District. Mm-hmm. And then you said that you maintain a residence here. And so I was kind of curious what you mean by maintain a residence and how much time you live here compared to living up there.
Yes, that's a good question. So one of the positive benefits of COVID was I oversee student teachers that receive their teaching credential from George Fox University, and they have to be observed in the classroom. Actually, working with students, can they maintain classroom control and such? It's a lot of fun. Prior to COVID, I'd get in my car and I'd drive to a school in McMinnville or in Vancouver, Washington. They have certificates in Washington as well from George Fox. So I would sit in the classroom. Then COVID came around. And that's the reason we have such a teacher shortage in the nation, is because there was a year with a lack of different topic. But there was some phenomenal software that came about. So just like there's a council member watching from a different location right now, last year I didn't visit any schools. It was all virtual. So I did all my observations from Grants Pass. North Carolina, I go to maybe a week or two every 2 to 3 months to spend time with my son, and then I come back. So.
Okay, so you spend most of your time here and then some time in Northern Oregon and a little bit of time in North Carolina?
I spend a good chunk of time here, yes. I'm a traveler.
All right, great. Thank you.
Yes, since I retired. I also am retired. Yes.
Rick and Val, did you have any questions you wanted to ask?
Not really. I think I wanted to ask about the economic, and it was asked. So I think you've done a great job of asking questions. I think that show, and I think I pretty much know the goals of what you're saying. So you've done a good job of answering the questions, and a lot of them are intertwined. So I will give you kudos for that. So
Thank you.
Rick?
Thank you, Kathy. Your presentation pretty much answered my questions, but I appreciate the background you have and could be bringing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Brian?
I just had a question for staff. I see that we only have one applicant, and I was curious if this was the first round of advertising for the position or if there's been multiple advertisements.
We always do multiple advertisements when we've only received one, so this was our second round.
Thank you.
Kathy, did you have anything else that you wanted to add about your interest in HBSC?
No, just thank you. I think it's disheartening to see a town go a direction that you loved and you were born in and you grew up in, and your parents went to high school here and grandparents lived here. And there was a time, maybe in the early 80s or so, where I thought, uh-oh, some of those beautiful shops were going away and G Street wasn't what it is. But now I have people come here for vacations. It's gorgeous, from things such as the bears and the beautiful flowers. I was down cleaning off a sidewalk this morning on the property we own, and there was a group of individuals that come through town in the mornings, and they clean things up. I've never seen that anywhere. It is so clean here. And went to the fair Wednesday night, and that was a lot of fun. That's changed a lot. I was worried because so many older, I think I saw you had a booth there. That was cool. There's so many older folks at the fair that were running everything, and I wished we saw more younger folks running the booths and such. But I have no questions. I want to say thank you for making Grants Pass what it is today. It doesn't happen by accident.
Well, thank you for being here and for answering our questions, and sorry about the delay getting started.
That's
but
okay.
we will get back to you as soon as possible about the appointment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
You too, thank you.
All right. Next up, looks like Amber's coming up. We're going to do the housing production strategy.
Beth, can I have you test really quick to see if you can take control of the screen?
Well, I can't control the screen if you're presenting it, but if I wanted to share my screen, then I can do that.
Okay. Yep, we'll go ahead and pull it down and have you share your screen.
Okay.
And then I'll do introductions once I make sure everything, oh, perfect, okay. So I'm gonna do a quick introduction, sorry for the delay. So I have Beth Goodman here. She is our consultant with Eco Northwest, who's been working with the city on our housing production strategy, which is an 8-year plan for our housing strategies that we're hoping to choose to move forward with and explore further in the next 8 years. Today is a mid-project check-in, so we're giving you kind of a progress report on where we've been in the last couple months working on this. We don't currently need a motion, but we do want to make sure that you have the opportunity to tell us if we're going in the wrong direction, or if you like the direction we're going on, and if any of the strategies stand out that you're hoping we maybe would like to include or not include. So I'll hand this off to Beth, and we'll get started.
Great. And
Let me open
could you
the
tell
screen.
me,
Did not.
Could
Give
you
me
tell me
1 second,
about-
Beth. I got to get the screen going.
okay.
It's got to warm up. Okay. We're just going to give it like a minute to warm up the light.
So while you're doing that, about how long, what time should we make sure to be finished with this discussion? I know we started late, and I don't want to get in the way of any other items on your agenda.
We set aside about an hour for this.
Okay, all right, so about 1:15 or so.
Thank you. Okay, looks like the screen is up and ready.
Okay. So thank you for having me here this morning. Well, it's now afternoon. What we're working with is developing a housing production strategy. It's an 8-year action plan, so something the city is going to be implementing over the next 8 years. It builds from the housing needs analysis, which we'll talk about in a few moments, but we start off by looking at additional information about housing need in Grants Pass, and then we've done a little bit more stakeholder engagement. And we're right in the middle of the process of developing the strategies. We've been working with your Housing Advisory Committee, especially with a subcommittee of that group, and we'll be going back to the larger group here in October to talk about the strategies and make sure that we've got the right strategies on the list. In the end, what you get is a housing production strategy report with actions that Grants Pass is going to implement, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, over the next 8 years. So there's a lot of detail in each of the actions that really the city won't decide on some of that detail until implementation starts to commence. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into this. So the housing production strategy is connected to the H&A. It's expected to happen a year after, well, within a year of the H&A completing. The housing needs analysis is about buildable land and forecasts for growth. The housing production strategy is about better understanding housing needs, especially for housing that's affordable for low-income households, for people who live and work in Grants Pass. And then identifying ways that the city can support development of new housing and or preservation of existing housing. And we'll be talking about some of those ways here shortly. Here's our project schedule. We're right in the middle of it. We expect to meet twice more with the HAC committee and come back to you in January or so, and then in April, looking at acceptance by April of the housing production strategy, once we've had all of your input baked into the strategy. So just to very quickly go over some key housing needs in Grants Pass. What we're looking at here is housing that's financially attainable depending on income. So the median family income in Grants Pass is $59,000. As of 2021, a household with that median income can afford a unit that rents for about $1,400, almost $1,500 a month. And when you look at asking rent in Grants Pass, not including certain types of utilities, which are often included in this, it's about that much. So your housing that is rental housing is just barely affordable to households making 100% of median family income. And so that's for a family of 4. A lot of the problem in affording housing is for people who have income below 100% of median family income. A lot of these are people who work in Grants Pass. So you see a number of different occupations that we're showing down at the bottom here. So a household earning less than half or about half of median family income can afford about $740 a month in rent. I'm sure that there's not very many places in Grants Pass that's affordable at that rent that's in decent condition. So we're looking at affordability by income. When we look at this in Grants Pass, this is the percentage of households in these different income groups and the number of households in these income groups. So the highest need we're seeing, generally speaking, is below 120% of median family income. When you're looking at housing that's affordable at less than 60% of median family income, so less than, I don't know, $35,000 or so, you're looking at housing when it's newly built that's going to be publicly subsidized. So that's often housing that the state has a role in building and the federal government has a role in building. And then when you look at between 60% and 120% of median family income, you might call these your middle income households. All of this, I would say, is housing for people who live and work in Grants Pass. So essentially what one might call workforce housing. So I'm sure you've heard a lot about cost burden. I won't talk to you about it a lot, but just to review, a household is said to be cost burdened if they're paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs. And they're severely cost burdened if they pay more than 50% of their income on housing costs. And so what we see is that renter households, especially low-income households, are cost burdened most frequently, but owner households are also cost burdened fairly frequently at the lower income levels. As incomes increase, rates of cost burden decrease. In addition to information about affordability and income, we also look at how housing needs differ by different groups. So people experiencing homelessness, whether it's chronically or temporarily, or whether they're alone or with children, they have different housing needs, and there's a lot of complexity in housing needs for people experiencing homelessness, but they have different housing needs from other groups of people. When you look at racial or ethnic groups, in addition to issues with income, they're more likely to be disproportionately cost burdened. So they have higher rates of cost burden than other groups. And some of their difficulties are about finding housing that they can access without discrimination. So issues with fair housing, application of fair housing law, as well as housing that fits the unique needs of their households. So for instance, if you're looking at a multi-generational household, they're going to need physically different housing than a household that's not multi-generational. People 65 years and older and people with disabilities, their housing needs are similar to each other. So again, they're disproportionately cost burdened compared to the average household. They need housing that's accessible, like physically accessible. In other words, if somebody has mobility challenges, they may need ramps or wider doors. They may need services, especially for people who have mental health issues. And they also need housing, access to housing without discrimination. So there's some nuances to this. Before I go on and talk much about the HPS, are there any questions?
Yes, we do have some questions. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I actually have a question on this slide. At the bottom it says, there's a note that says Oregon Housing and Community Service reported 2 counts in 2021, an estimated count and a reported count. And the count on the graph is the estimated count. Do you know what the reported count was?
Last I checked on this, the reported count wasn't out. But we will check on whether the reported count is out now. I believe it was supposed to be out late summer, early fall.
Okay, and then the other 2 years there are the reported counts or the estimated?
Those would have been the reported counts.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, go ahead, thank you.
Okay. So in developing the housing production strategy, the first thing we start with is thinking about what the city's role is in housing development, broadly speaking. You have to have land, public policy that supports housing development, access to capital, and market feasibility in order for development to occur. The city has roles in several of these. So the city directly influences public policy, such as zoning or density or design requirements that have to be in place to allow a developer to build a profitable project. The city also influences land. So you expanded your UGB a couple of years ago and getting that land rezoned and into the city limits, making it available for urban density housing. Those are 2 issues, as well as making sure that there's, as well as issues related to infrastructure for off-site development. So that can be prohibitively expensive to allowing housing to develop. So there's issues there. Cities generally have little role in access to capital, except for things like rehabilitation programs, if you have a loan or a grant program. Cities do have some limited influence on market feasibility through things like SDC waivers or deferrals in some cases where that's allowed, or through property tax abatements. So a city can make it more financially feasible for development that the city wants to see happen. So say development of income restricted affordable housing. The city can support that. So as we're thinking about the different strategies, we're thinking about what the city's role is. And then we're also thinking about the different impacts of different strategies. So a strategy that involves funding or land acquisition, that's going to have more direct impact, make it more feasible to support development than, say, producing informational resources or partnering to leverage resources and efforts. So I would say that those 2, informational resources and partnering, are necessary in a lot of cases, but not on their own sufficient to result in new housing development. Sometimes removal of regulatory barriers, such as getting land zoned for urban development, that can be enough on its own to support some types of housing development, but of course not all. So once the city has its housing production strategy, the city is committed to attempting implementation of the actions identified in the HPS. It is entirely possible that some of the actions in the HPS may be ones that when the city looks at more closely in enough detail, it may choose not to implement them. And there's things that the city has to do in order to address that issue. So identifying other strategies to meet the, to support the need that was identified for the strategy that is not implementable. The city's will also be required to update the Department of Land Conservation and Development. So that's the state organization that is tasked with monitoring progress on the HPS. And eventually, in 8 years, there'll be some requirement to comment on the effectiveness of the HPS. So that implies a certain amount of monitoring of progress. So strategies not identified in the HPS, of course, can still be implemented by the city, but the city is not held to specific action by the state. So for instance, you've already implemented a CET. If you hadn't, and the CET didn't make the HPS, obviously the city could still implement a CET even if it wasn't in the HPS. I'm imagining that there's going to have to be some flexibility in moving actions that aren't implementable out of the HPS and newly identified actions into the HPS over this next 8-year period. So before I go on to talk to you about some of the people we talked to, are there any questions about requirements?
Any questions? Not seeing any hands go up.
Okay. So I want to leave enough time for a discussion of the different strategies. So I'll go over what we've been hearing in a couple of focus groups we did. We talked to service providers, so different groups who are helping low-income households, or in some cases people experiencing homelessness, with housing. And what they identified as the biggest issues were just simply lack of available units. And that's not even necessarily with affordability, but affordability, of course, underlies all of that. Need for better jobs with better pay to address homelessness, and I would say to address housing needs in general, especially for low and moderate income households. So your households with income below 80% of median family income. The housing issues are, of course, inextricably tied with economic development, but this isn't an economic development project. So this is focusing pretty narrowly on housing. So a need to invest in transitional housing to support youth, adults, and families from transitioning from homelessness or from living in income-restricted housing onto market rate housing. So need to build up more, so higher density. Working with the community to bring them along to avoid people who are really opposed to some things that might well support the community well, but people haven't heard enough about them. And they'd also like to see sustainability and resilience incorporated more into the planning process, and that's, of course, in large part, at least partially, about fire preparedness, wildfire preparedness, as well as other types of sustainability and long-term resiliency. So they suggest supporting transitional housing, and what that's partially about is talking about housing for people experiencing homelessness a little bit differently. So drop the term urban campground and focus more on traditional transitional housing, developing a resource center for people experiencing homelessness. Look at how ARPA funds could be used to support emergency shelter, increased densities, which I believe is something the city is working on, engaging the community, and tying housing policy more to economic development. Look at employee assistance programs. That's certainly something that employers can do to support housing development, and consider community ownership models of housing. We also talked to affordable developers of income-restricted affordable housing. So this is housing that's affordable at below 60% of median family income, so below about $35,000 or $40,000 for a household of four. And so what they were telling us the issue is there's not enough developable serviced land. It's a barrier to development. And of course, that ties right into bringing land into the city limits and getting infrastructure and physical services to it. The city needs to look at building up more, so more land that's zoned for multifamily development and allowing greater densities, especially for multifamily. Again, they brought up an economic development issue that incomes don't align with affordable rents. And then there's challenges accessing state funds, and that ends up being a little bit of a complicated sort of issue. So there's a suggestion for city staff to advocate with the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department to modify their criteria for awarding low-income housing tax credits. That's a very complicated thing that I'm hoping we don't go into a lot here. Implementing the nonprofit corporation low-income housing tax credit. That's a tax credit that supports development of housing that's affordable at 60% or below. It can be awarded to any nonprofit supporting that kind of housing development. Anybody who's partnering with the housing authority can already get a tax credit like that, but a nonprofit who's not partnering with the housing authority, this is how they would access that tax credit. So that can remove a barrier. focus on establishing a land bank. And this group says focus less on partnerships with community land trusts, but realize that this group is really focused on development of multifamily housing that's income restricted and affordable, and community land trusts do something different than that. And then allow greater density. And finally, we talked with market rate developers. Their first thing out of the gate was that incomes can't support development of new market rate multifamily housing. They made an important point, which is that building housing isn't much different in terms of cost in Grants Pass than it is in, say, Medford or other parts of Oregon like the Willamette Valley, but incomes are considerably lower. And so that points to the gap between what's affordable and what people can actually afford to pay for. And so there's a few resources that support development for housing that's affordable between 60 and 120% of median family income, which is the same as AMI. And that's market rate multifamily housing. Infrastructure and lack of infrastructure is also a barrier. And then they requested a blending incentives to make market rate multifamily housing more financially feasible, and we'll talk about those. So their strategies were, let's see, supporting development of off-site infrastructure, so that's your water, your wastewater, your roads, addressing code barriers that are limiting density, and we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. Support for the multi-unit property tax exemption. That's a property tax exemption that's on our list that's available potentially if the city implemented it for development of housing that's in this income range. Looking at system development charge exemptions and deferrals to get projects off the ground. Looking at rent buy downs or subsidies. This requires an increasing amount of money at that point. And tying planning for housing and economic development together more. So what we heard from these three groups is it validated some of what we were thinking. It gave us some other ideas and places to focus on a little bit differently. And so it's informing the development of the strategies. And some of this input isn't into the memorandum that you received because we just finished these focus groups. So we'll be working that in as we're going forward. Are there any questions about what we heard?
We don't have any hands up. Oh, yep, we do.
Okay.
Rob, go ahead.
On slide 14, under priorities and suggestions, one of the suggestions was consider employee assistance programs, and I don't know what that means.
So it's really employer assistance programs, and the city has less of a role in this, which is in part of why it's not in the strategies you're seeing. But if you imagine an employer who gives a household a stipend for housing costs, or who supports development of certain types of housing that their workers can access. It's those kind of things. There's a lot of different ways that can take shape. And the city's role in that kind of thing is usually as a convener. So somebody who brings people together for talking, but cities aren't usually driving that. And so Amber would be able to do that if this became an option, even without having this in the HPS.
Thank you.
Valerie?
Yes, and adding on to that, just below that on the same slide, it says consider community ownership models of housing. Could you explain what community ownership models are?
There's a number of different ones. One type is a community land trust. And so a community land bank and a land trust are things that are often talked about together. A land bank is about having land where housing can be developed. And let's just say that's regardless of what kind of housing it is. A community land trust often will work with a land bank to get housing that is, to get land that is lower cost available, and then build housing that's typically for owner-occupied housing. And in a land trust, you have, like Proud Ground is an example of a land trust that's well-known, that's been operating a lot in Portland and is operating out of Portland. A land trust builds the housing and then is selling it to households that have lower than average income. And then when that household wants to resell that housing, they get a limited amount of equity, usually. They don't get the full equity in the housing because it was subsidized for them. So even if the housing has increased in value, they get a limited amount of that increase, and then that subsidy is passed on to the next household. Another version of that is a cooperative, like a limited equity cooperative ownership model. And that's one that's not necessarily a nonprofit in the same way like a land trust. There's a number of them around the state.
Thank you. I think we're done with questions.
Okay.
Oh, we have one more. Sorry. Rick?
I don't know if this is appropriate time to go back or wait till she finishes.
Now it's fine.
Okay. If you could go back to slide number 9.
Yes.
So as Brian was indicated, estimated and reported counts, how do they obtain those counts? Is it done through census, or do you do walk through town with an individual that talks with each person personally and then asks them the questions?
So these are all point in time counts. And let's set aside 2021 because it was a little bit extra special still because of COVID, which is why we've got estimated counts right now. But what typically happens is an organization who does this every 2 years does the point in time count. So they'll visit shelters, they'll look around for people experiencing homelessness, and as you say, ask them questions. It occurs every year at about the same time, I believe in January. And Amber could probably tell you the organization who does it in Grants Pass. All I'm thinking about is Neighbor Works Umpqua up in Douglas County.
And do you know if the questions are asked, of course, one of the questions would be either homeless or lack of housing, but does it go into detail as what type of housing they would actually like? In other words, single family or apartment, or it just ends, the conclusion is with a general question, not a specific question?
No, there's other questions about their condition and experience in homelessness, but it's not about what kind of housing would you like.
And the purpose, my question is, if they say we prefer camping versus living in an apartment, is that information obtained or not really by the questions that are put forth?
I doubt that information is obtained now.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we can go back to the presentation.
Okay. All right, and so on the next few slides, we'll be presenting the actions in the HPS. The feedback we're looking for is, do you have comments on the initiatives or the actions? And we'll explain those in a few moments. Are we missing anything big? Is there anything that we're talking about that just doesn't belong in the HPS? So broadly speaking, are we going in the right direction? And do you have other comments? So what we've identified is 5 types of broad categories of actions. Now understand that some actions, as you'll see in the slide in a few moments, can have roles in multiple types of housing development. So we've thought about these actions in terms of income levels. So removing barriers to development of low and moderate income affordable rental housing. So that's housing that's affordable to your households that generally speaking have income between 60% and 100%, sometimes up to 120% of median family income. So these are households that are probably living in market rate housing and can afford market rate housing, but new market rate housing isn't being built in general because it's not financially feasible. And so this is often multifamily housing of a variety of types. So increasing opportunities for affordable home ownership. This again is for households with income below 120% of median family income. Housing isn't being built that is affordable for home ownership in that income range. This often connects with things like community land trusts. Opportunities for affordable homeownership is something that's particularly difficult to do because it's very expensive and there's not as good funding sources as there is for the next one, which is encourage development of income restricted affordable housing. This is often housing, this is generally housing that's affordable at less than 60% of median family income. It's housing that's oftentimes generally funded through state and federal resources. So if you hear talk about the low-income housing tax credit, which is a state and federal funding that's offered for that. It's not a tax credit like we'll talk about in a few minutes at all, but that's a source of funding that goes into this kind of housing. So that's another initiative. And then looking at preservation of your existing low and moderate income affordable housing. Some of that is going to be things like your mobile and manufactured home parks, or looking at rehabilitation of existing housing for low-income households. And then addressing homelessness is the fifth one. So what we've got as we're looking at the different actions is you can see we've got each of these 5 initiatives here. And you can see, say, something like rezoning land for housing. The black box means that it's has a major role, and the empty box means that it has a role, but it's more minor. So rezoning land for housing is that land that was brought into the urban growth boundary, but is still in county zoning, and is not annexed into the city limits. And the barrier to rezoning that land is about the transportation studies that have to go along with that. This is an important action for these 3 different initiatives. But of course, it's not an important action for preserving your existing housing because you're not trying to, build new housing with preserving. So I'd like to walk through the actions and pause occasionally for questions. But before I do that, do you have any questions about the initiatives? They're essentially buckets, if you'll think of it that way.
Not seeing any hands here.
Okay, so the ones that are that have this box around them in the teal color, those are the ones that we think are perhaps most important for any question. I will go ahead. I've already explained the rezoning. Looking at support for outreach and education, this is partially about fair housing. So getting more education for landlords and tenants about fair housing laws. And it's also education for the community more broadly about what are Grants Pass's housing needs and who has them. Because a lot of your community, just like a lot of all of our communities in Oregon, have a lot of unmet housing needs. Developing a land bank, that's a more interesting one. If you remember the slide a few ago that showed that putting land into the development process was a very high impact action, that's why this is on the list. So you've already got some land that's publicly owned that's identified for parks. Is there opportunities for other publicly owned land to be identified in the future for development of, say, housing for home ownership, or for development of housing for income restricted housing, or to address, say, homelessness? That could be used there as well. The city could also have a different role in land banking. The city could purchase land and assemble parcels that were small but next to each other, and then convey that land, say, to a developer. If it was market rate, maybe convey that land at the cost it was to purchase it. Or the city could put it into the pot, if you will, for development of income restricted housing or a community land trust, so that it is a resource there that contributes to building housing, the market feasibility of building that housing. So the next action is, this one's a little less defined, and we need to get some more specifics of it in here, but it's about a program to support affordable homeownership. This is mostly going to be, that this shouldn't be, that it's not that one, it's mostly right here, entirely right here. This one is one that the city is likely to be a partner in. So is there a land trust, for instance, the city could be working with? Is there another nonprofit that is doing affordable homeownership? And what is it that the city can do to support that? The city will have some funds that come back from the state that are the result of the construction excise tax that can be used to support affordable homeownership. You've got an SDC waiver program, and part of the idea here, and Amber is going to have to chime in on this one because this one's come up recently, is revisiting that waiver program to focus more on density. So using a program that you've already got to focus more on density for development, to support housing development by making it more financially feasible. Increasing densities to support development of housing that's affordable, sort of more broadly. I believe that this is something that the city is working on currently. So here's two of the tax credits that we talked about. The multi-unit tax credit is something that the city could adopt. There's a lot of flexibility in that tax credit. It's up to 10 years for new multifamily development. The city gets to decide where to apply that tax credit. So for instance, City of Eugene applied it in downtown and in the corridor that goes out towards the university. The city has the opportunity to decide how and when to offer that. So what's the criteria for offering that tax credit? So some cities are using a criteria of it has to support housing that's affordable at less than 80% of median family income. So there's some income qualification in that. It has to be shown, the development has to show, the developer has to show that it's not financially feasible without that tax exemption to build that housing. So there's some complexity in this, but there's a lot of flexibility in it. The city council gets to decide whether or not to award that tax exemption on a case-by-case basis. The nonprofit corporation low-income housing tax exemption, again, that's only for income-restricted housing development. It's not for any other type of housing development, and it's for nonprofits that are building that housing but aren't, say, the housing authority and aren't partnered with the housing authority. So that can be a long-term tax exemption. It's used by a lot of cities across Oregon to support the operations and development of new income-restricted housing. So then there's action about rehabilitation of existing low-cost, unregulated, affordable housing. So if you think about that on looking at a household that has low income, but especially for homeowners, that could be a grant or loan program. And I think this one is about expanding your existing program. Looking at development of a resource center for people experiencing homelessness. And so the reason that it's primarily about people experiencing homelessness, but the reason that it also is connected to development of income-restricted housing is because that kind of housing is there keeping from people from becoming homeless. And then using urban renewal, which you've already got this program into your urban renewal program, to support housing development and infrastructure development in the urban renewal district. So those are the actions that we have on the list right now. We've got a few that we've moved off the list, but we are making recommendations about them. So they aren't going to be official actions in the HBS, but we don't want them lost. And so
Beth, we have a question.
Good.
Rick, go ahead.
So on your action plan, I've heard that people are hesitant on going into like multifamily housing because if they're going to be the landlord, then the laws that are out there tend to favor the renter versus the landlord, and therefore it scares away those investment people. Do you have any action or anything in the future that helps, I want to say, protect the landlord? Because I've heard stories where supposedly somebody has many rental units, but a renter is in there, hasn't paid rent in 8 months, and of course, that does not encourage them to do additional units. How can that scenario be addressed?
And so that is an issue more with state law. So I don't think that scenario can be addressed at the local level in quite the same way. So when you're looking at how are we going to support, you're talking about housing that's in this income group. So it's landlords, pardon me, for this group, the low and moderate affordable rental housing. It's honestly a type of housing that's really hard to get developed. One of the reasons may well be part of what you're saying. Although it is being developed, new multifamily housing is being developed at places across the state. So I think it's partially about getting more partnerships with more developers who are willing and able to develop in a place like Grants Pass beyond your existing developers, as well as working more with your existing developers and identifying issues that are barriers to development of housing. And so one of the issues that we identified in this is really about densities of multifamily housing. So I think Amber could speak to this a little bit better, but some of your open space requirements are making it difficult to actually build multifamily housing because the open space requirements require so much land that it literally doesn't work on paper, much less actually building something. So I think some of that is you have to accept what the state laws are, or work with your representatives to get state laws changed, and then work one-on-one with developers to understand where the barriers are.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions right now? No?
What do you think about where we're going? If this came in front of you, the full HBS, and it had these actions in it, is there anything you think is missing?
Brian?
So you said the ones that have like a teal box around them, you see as more of a priority?
For discussion with this group. But any of these could be talked about as a priority. Essentially, I think some of these are a little bit harder and some of these are easier.
Okay. So one of the issues that I don't know if it's being explicitly addressed with this report or not is the fact that we have our local development community has the ability to produce about half of the units that we actually need to get to where we need to be. So with that particular problem, is that something that might be addressed with that second bullet there that's on the screen right now, just outreach and education to promote housing development? And that would probably need to occur inside the community and outside the community?
Yeah, and to a certain degree, I mean, Amber may disagree with me, but some of that is probably a role that Amber could or is taking on in building those relationships with developers who are outside the community. So people developing in Medford, people developing in Eugene or in Portland. This is going to be important when you talk about the missing middle type of housing that we have all just authorized in our larger communities. Not many developers know how to do that. Increasingly are having more experience. So currently we don't have that information in there in this item, but I think you've got a good point of we need to add it in. So yes.
Okay, thank you.
And I was just going to add to that, I think a lot of it has to do with bonding and the capacity of a builder to have the ability to get the bonding and insurance capabilities to build something larger than, and I don't, and that's something I don't know how to do. Like I said, I guess, but you know, ask Amber to woo them into our community because that is an issue, is that ability to do that, and the ability to have the money to invest. You need investors, and investors want a return on their money, and when you're looking at a community that doesn't have really, like you said, our jobs, and I think you see this throughout, is that just as much energy needs to be thrown in to try to bring up the income level of our community as well. So, you know, and that's such a hard thing to do and know how to tackle. But I do, like I said, I think we were, you know, when I look at a lot of this, I know that we're really working on it. We're working with ODOT and working to try to get the land and the transportation impact studies done. We thought we could do it in a lot different way than we were informed after the fact. So we're scrambling to do those sorts of things now. So a lot of what I see here are things that I really think that we've been addressing and we're trying to do. It's just those bigger issues, and that's where I think it's important to bring people together like we are planning to on this in September, to have a discussion as how can we as a community kind of figure out how some of these things.
I see that Joel has his hand up.
Yeah, Joel, go ahead.
Thank you, Beth. Good presentation. One of the things that strikes me is this production strategy is not yours, it's ours.
Yes.
Yes, and you put it together for us and did a lot of the groundwork for it, but it's something that we own, and we need to recognize that and move forward. What is the relationship? I got two questions, Beth. What is the relationship to this strategy, and how does that play out in the relationship between Grants Pass and the state, LCDC, or whoever the regulating authority is?
Ultimately LCDC, but the Department of Land Conservation and Development. So okay. When the city council has accepted this, you don't adopt this as a land use document. This isn't the land use document, very much on purpose. When the city council has accepted this and sends it to DLCD, it will have in it for each action an implementation timeline. And we're paying a lot of attention to making sure that the implementation timeline does not make your staff nuts. Because there's requirements for, if you go 90 days over, or maybe it was 45, I forget which right now, but if you go over when you said you'd implement an action, you have to report on why. So we'll be setting that implementation timeline so that it makes sense, and that actions, there's a couple of actions that all hit the deadline at the same time, say the last day of the year or something like that, at a predictable time. So that the city isn't forever reporting and reporting and reporting. There's a midpoint report that the city must do about why you've, which actions have you implemented that you said you would, and of them that you said you would that you haven't implemented, why, and what are you going to do about that? And so the why might be, it's on its way, it's just taking a little bit longer than we were hoping. Or it might be, If I left on here one of the actions that has been removed, which was issuing a general obligation bond to support housing, which I heard enough people talking about the fact that that's not going to work. So since it's not my document, it's yours, we've taken it off of here. But say that was one and it's just not politically financially feasible. You'd have to substitute in some other action to support the housing need that was addressing. So
then with that, Beth, what are the consequences of not meeting the timelines, and what are the benefits of meeting them? Obviously, there's some benefits to the community of meeting them, but in terms of that relationship with the state, what's the benefits and the drawbacks of not meeting the timelines?
there is no explicit drawbacks. The state, will the state do more than smack your hand and say, bad city, you are supposed to do this? I haven't seen any evidence of that. But there's going to be, as we go along and get into this, some cities that are more and less earnest about trying to address these needs. And this law and requirement here is here in part to address the cities that really they don't want to talk about affordable housing. They don't want it in their community. And we've got a few of those in Oregon. So I expect at some point there will be more explicit consequences. Is it going to be withholding of funding or something like that? I don't know. I mean, withholding infrastructure funding would be entirely counterproductive. But there is effort at the state level to change how we deal with Goal 10, generally speaking, the housing needs analysis and the housing production strategy, putting more emphasis on the housing production strategy. And I've heard talk about, at least at the LCD, staff know that part of the barrier is lack of infrastructure. And it's not that, a city doesn't want to go out and build a new road or extend a wastewater line. It's that the city doesn't have money to do that. So I don't know, my idealistic side says hopefully that will rise up and the legislature will look at it and make some decisions about paying for some of that.
Yeah, I was hoping that there would be some benefits of trying to meet those deadlines that would include just what you're talking about. Go ahead.
I think it would be. So
yeah. The other thing I wanted to emphasize, you emphasized it and Val mentioned it in passing of the economic development and affordable housing. You need to have people that make money, and unfortunately in our county, over half to 2/3 of our income is transfer payments. That includes Social Security, because we have our demographics are older. We do have some folks with pensions, obviously, and then welfare payments. The per capita income is really low compared to the rest of the state. How does that play out in this strategy? Economic development and those low incomes.
So we don't have an economic development action at this point. I'm hesitant to make there be an economic development action just because we haven't. And that's not necessarily a good reason not to do it. So what we're looking at is we're making certain recommendations. So like preservation of manufactured home parks, or preservation, this is a good example, preservation of regulated affordable housing. That is an important thing to do, but the city's role in that is smaller. The city gets information, and if it's paying attention to that information, it can know when regulated affordable rental units are essentially their tax credits are running out, so they could be lost as income restricted units. So the recommendation is essentially pay attention to that, but it's not a specific action because there's not a lot that needs to be done by the city specifically. And so there could be a recommendation, for instance, about economic development and tying economic development closer, to housing. But I'm not sure, do you as a city, do you need somebody to say, you said you'd do economic development, why aren't you doing it? Or is the city already motivated to do it?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. We got an industrial park that's been sitting vacant for a long time.
I was just making myself a note as part of the framing for why the HPS is important and why there's problems in Grants Pass is the income levels, the relatively low income levels. So we have information about that. So that is an important point. Are you saying that you'd like to see that raised up more in the strategy and you'd like to see an action or a recommendation about it?
I don't think it would hurt anything.
And what is it that you, without a specific thing, I mean, we can go talk to other people about this, but without a specific action, I would probably put it in the recommendations.
One of the things that strike me, and I don't know how you want to put it into your document, and that, even if this is what it would look like, but there's synergy between the two. And both need infrastructure, both need streets, both need water and sewer. And so when we develop some of the low-income services, if you can do it in areas that would also help facilitate future industrial development, it seems like that might be a synergistic thing between the two.
You have that in your urban renewal planning. So urban renewal is functionally really about economic development, but housing can be a part of it. So you've got an urban renewal plan. It includes some of your industrial areas and downtown. The focus of it is about infrastructure development. And if you see that infrastructure development where you can, obviously you're not going to build housing in the middle of your industrial district, but let's say in downtown. If you have an infrastructure project done there that also supports housing, then that's all to the good. That is, as you say, a synergy that's very positive. So we can emphasize that there, certainly. And then we can make this into a recommendation to look for more opportunities around that. I mean, yeah.
Well, I appreciate you coming, and I appreciate your presentation. Thank you very much, Beth.
Sure.
I was just going to add, and I agree, I think a lot of these things we're really trying to do, but a lot of it comes down to money that's not available to us. It's like rezoning land. We'd love to, but you have to pay ODOT and get the transportation study. That's a cost. Subsidizing housing and getting more tax credits. Well, we did just apply for a tax credit. We didn't get it. We've got to wait till the next cycle because the money's not there. So, I mean, we can do all of those things and we can go through, and I cannot tell you the amount of money and time and energy goes through for applying for these grants. It's costing a lot of money for the people to upfront do that, and then they don't get them. So then they got to go back to the next round because the money's not available from the state. So, we can do things, but you're just going in circles if there's not money there coming from somewhere that obviously in a community that has such a low income level, it's just not going to happen. And some of the things on the strategy, the multiple unit limited tax exemption and the low income housing tax exemption, that's going to take away from our tax base, which we already have taken away from our tax base with our urban renewal plan. So it's just kind of like, and I really want this all to happen, but sometimes I look at how much money is spent to do all these studies and to do the housing and everything, and sometimes I think we could have used that money to just get the infrastructure in, and that's my frustration, is that we just keep building these layers of bureaucracy that get in our way. So that's my soapbox for the day.
I certainly understand that, and that's That's why we had a general obligation bond on there. But since the community is not supporting a general obligation bond around public safety, it seems unlikely for affordable housing.
Some of these items, I know once we get it in a plan, we can ask the state and federal governments for assistance too, but we have to get it in the plan.
Yeah, that's true. We are asking them now.
Are there other feedback for Beth on initiatives or actions you see missing or ideas in the plan that you don't want to go forward? Brian?
You really love and want to see more of.
Okay. Anything you love?
I had a question about that other document that you had pulled up there. It had 3 columns, and the third column was like items that were removed. And I was just wondering, I can kind of read it, but those items were removed based on what?
So these 3 are essentially now they're initiatives. And well, all right. This one and this one is an initiative. This one, the offsite infrastructure, that one's really in the urban renewal. And given the lack of a general obligation bond, the city doesn't have money to build offsite infrastructure outside of the urban renewal district. So that one was just taken out. I mean, it could be moved to a recommendation, but in the absence of funding, that's just not going to happen. Using construction excise tax, that's already happening. So it wasn't really removed. It's just being talked about differently. And then the prioritizing access to an RV park for long-term residency. Amber probably remembers more than I do why this is removed.
I believe we don't currently have any restrictions on RV parks. Usually they're self-imposed for long-term residency, so there wouldn't really be an action for the city to do on that.
Thank you.
Great.
So some of these were just, ideas that seemed good at the time. Then when we looked into them further, they weren't fruitful.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or feedback? Brad has something. Go ahead, Brad.
I guess I just wanted, it feels like you're wrapping up, just bring you back to one of Beth's first slides and on the timing of this. We are still very much in the middle. So when you talk about removed or not removed, anything of course could be put back. I mean, if council wants it, but there has been one presentation to the Planning Commission, so they gave some feedback, but you can see on there's still a ways to go. That at the end of that, and remind me if I'm wrong, Beth, but that is a mandatory deadline from the state. We do have to adopt a housing production strategy by that. Is it June of 23, Beth?
No, I would have to actually go up and look up what your actual deadline is, because I don't have that on top of my head. But what this is a hard end to the grant. So
yeah, that's right.
I have my work.
I think it might actually be December of 23,
right.
And
that makes sense.
But at any point, as Amber and I and Beth, as we're working through this, both with the stakeholder groups, with the Planning Commission, they're going to have another opportunity, a bite at the apple here in March. I guess I just wanted to underscore this is very much so. If you have other feedback that you want to send in to us, we'll just keep incorporating it into the draft.
Thanks, Brad.
Yes.
Brian has something.
I just had one more question. So we have all these recommendations, and I know that we're only mid-project right now. When we get the draft report, are we going to see more specifics as far as, where we might want to focus our energies, like which ones are going to give us more bang for our buck or be more productive than others, potential, impact, number of units, things that are more than just like high level, ideas.
And some of that was at the end of the memorandum you have, if you made it all the way down to like page 30 or something like that. Some of that's there, and yes, it'll be in there. But also realize that some of this ends up being intertwined. So something might have a lower impact, but be necessary to support something else. So keep that in mind as well. But yes, there'll be information. There'll be some more information about each action. Yes.
Okay.
But there's not going to be the information, I can think of your rezoning piece of, you know, do this, then do that, then do that, and do the other thing. There'll be more like, do what you've been doing in terms of, you know, prioritize where you want to do these rezonings first and focus your energy on that, and then do these other things. So it is going to be something, there's a reason it's an 8-year implementation plan.
Okay, thank you.
Certainly.
Rick?
So at some point, when we have an adoption of the plan and then it goes forward, what mechanism is available to see that we're obtaining those goals or making progress?
Well, we'll outline in the plan a monitoring process, so things to monitor and to report on. And then I would imagine it's Amber and Brad and other staff reporting, if you choose to do it annually or every other year, on progress. There may be opportunity for some grants to support some of these pieces, but in some cases it's a matter of the city deciding that it wants to go forward, say, I'll use MUPD as the example. Well, you've got some funds in your construction excise tax. Some of those funds have to be spent on developer incentives. Maybe that's the type of developer incentive the city chooses to implement. And so it's about walking through what is it we need to do to establish an urban renewal district, not an urban renewal district, I'm sorry, a multi-unit tax exemption district. So it's just about walking through the requirements of that at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Valerie?
Certainly.
And just adding to that, Beth, it's in looking at the timeline that goes through this project schedule, which I'm assuming is your project schedule to get us through it, which does go till June, and then there'll be a certain time that I'm assuming this would start, the 8 years would start, say, January 2024 is what we're kind of looking at?
That's probably what we would, I would need to look at the official schedules and all of that, but that's probably what you'd be looking at. But of course, you're doing some of these things ongoing as it goes.
Okay, so would some of the things that happened, say, before that be, or do we have to move on and have them happen all over again, just out of curiosity?
I would not delay doing things that you're working on now, and it may well be that you're able to give early check marks. Yes, we did that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Aaron, go ahead.
I'd just like to do a shout out to council. It's sort of neat to have, I think it's great to have a consultant here that's in a firm that's been working around the state, providing housing strategies for cities. And what we heard today, the majority of what we heard today, we've talked before on the dais because of your leadership, or we're implementing, or we're discussing, or we're exploring. So it was refreshing to see that we are somewhat ahead of the curve of what our potential plan might be. And so I just wanted to thank council for being proactive in coming up with housing solutions for our community.
Thank you. Yeah, it is great. We've been charging ahead with some of these ideas already, and like you just said, Beth, we don't need to slow down now. We need to keep going. The problem's not getting any better as quickly as we need it to. Thank you for being here with us today, and sorry about the delay getting started, but nice presentation, and
Thank you.
Stay in touch.
Oh, we'll be talking to you again.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, council, any discussion on that topic before we move along? Okay. Next up, county sales tax explanatory statement. Augustus is going to lead that one.
Council. So I've just come before you to briefly go through the county's explanatory statement for the sales tax. They're going to be finalizing the explanatory statement and everything that's going to be going into the voters pamphlet on Wednesday. Friday is the filing deadline. And so in this document, I'll start with Exhibit B. This is the caption, the question, and the ballot summary. As you can see, the county has allocated their total word count. Yes. Oh, okay, I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay, it's fine.
That's okay. And so the ballot summary very concisely says what the ballot measure is for. In the first paragraph at the end, where it's highlighted here, it states that the rate for the City of Grants Pass's public levy, safety levy would decrease. This, of course, mirrors the language that's in the ordinance. That
Hang on
Stop,
just
I'm
a
gonna stop
second.
for- yeah, 'cause we don't-
So it's, I have the one that says before the board, it's not the ordinance, it's the other one, so it has the in the matter of referring
Okay.
to, and then flip it open.
To the back. Okay,
to
thank you.
Exhibit C.
Okay, thank you for that. We were just trying to find where you were. I saw everybody up here scrambling. It's the second, the back page of,
it's the second page of the resolution. My apologies. So under the ballot summary in the first paragraph, it states what's pertinent to the city in terms of its public safety levy reduction. The rate for the City of Grants Pass's public safety levy would decrease. This mirrors the language that's in the ordinance that the public safety levy will decrease from $1.79 to 79 cents per assessed thousand. Are there any questions about the ballot summary, about any of this, the Exhibit B?
Any questions? Vanessa did send an email suggesting that we change the word would to could. I'm not sure if this is the exact spot, but I think because we left it with that line that the city council would retain the ability to make other adjustments.
So because the ordinance itself says that the city shall, the city shall reduce its public safety levy from $1.79 to 79 cents per assessed thousand, that it wouldn't be entirely accurate that the city could reduce it. It is in a shall statement in the ordinance.
Okay, so you didn't, the final sentence, I guess, that the city council shall retain the discretion to make any necessary budgetary adjustments to ensure appropriate city law enforcement funding. You don't find that to be in conflict with?
I do not, because that doesn't necessarily refer just to the levy. That could refer to other budgetary measures that city council chooses to make in order to make up the difference, should there be a difference.
Okay, so with this language, though, we would be obligated to reduce it from 179 to 79.
Based on the ordinance language that city council provided instruction for me to put into the county's ordinance. And I'll pull that up real quick so you know what because this was a discussion that we did have. And so here we have subsection E. This is what the ordinance reads. Upon passage of the LERAT, the Grants Pass City Council shall reduce the property tax levy for law enforcement for all city citizens subject to the levy from $1.79 to 79 cents per $1,000 of assessed value. Such levy reduction shall take effect in the following budget cycle or at any time to be determined by the City Council. The City Council shall retain the discretion to make any necessary budgetary adjustments to ensure appropriate city law enforcement funding.
Oh, I see. So that's the budgetary adjustments in the final line and not an adjustment to the levy.
Not necessarily, it could be, but it's not just specific to the levy. So if City Council has the discretion to make up the funds some other way, whether that's through the general fund, whether that's through a utility bill, whether that's through
Okay,
an
but
increase.
not the discretion to say, keep the levy at $1.79 or drop it to 125, or we
I
could drop
mean-
it below 79, but it needs,
So long as it doesn't go above $1.79, council retains the discretion to bring the levy all the way back to the top if necessary.
okay. I guess in that sense, it just seems to be a bit of a conflict between the measure directing the council to reduce it and whether or not there's the discretion if it was needed.
I don't believe that there's a conflict because there's a shall statement and then shall retain the discretion doesn't mean that council is going to make any budgetary adjustments. It only says that county retains, or the city retains the discretion to make necessary budgetary adjustments.
Okay. I see other hands, Rob and then Brian.
So, Augustus, I think we may have gone over this once before, but I don't remember. Now that it's kind of in black and white, I think it needs to be brought up again. So, assuming that the income or the revenue from the sales tax has been considered conservatively, and if the sales tax were to bring in an abundance of new funding, is the city locked into only reducing the levy $1 if the sales tax were to cover the entire levy?
No.
Okay, well this says that we will do from 179 to 79. That's what it says that we will do.
That's correct.
Okay, so how could we not do that? How could we reduce it completely? Because it says we're going to do that.
It's city council would retain the discretion to under levy by however much they would want to. Just because this is in the ordinance doesn't take away any of the city's council's authority to under levy at an amount lower than that. That's a matter of public policy for the city council.
Okay, thank you.
Brian?
So we have more than one shall that contradict each other. It says that we shall reduce a property tax, and then it says we shall retain discretion to not reduce the levy. So I 100% see those as contradictory, and it also says such levy reduction shall take effect in the following budget cycle or at any other time to be determined by city council. So when it says or at any other time, city council could potentially decide to not do it, or say they'll do it we'll do it later, we'll do it in 3 years. So there's multiple loopholes in this to make voters feel less confident that we will in fact reduce the levy, just based on these contradicting shalls and the fact that it says at any time determined by council.
So is there a question in there? Sorry.
Yeah, I just don't see how those reconcile.
Okay. So the city council shall retain the discretion to make any necessary budgetary adjustments does not say the city council shall retain the discretion to just improve the levy, to just increase the levy. There's multiple things that city council can do in order to make necessary budgetary adjustments to ensure that city law enforcement has funding. All that is saying is that all it's saying is something that's self-evident, that the city council has discretion to do what it needs to do to make sure that there's city law enforcement funding if the sales tax isn't as successful as the projections bear out to be. It isn't a conflict. It retains discretion not only for you as a city council, not only this current body, but for a body 10, 15 years down the line. Just because it says shall doesn't mean that you or a future body is going to raise the levy, but it wouldn't have been responsible to take that sort of authority away from city council, or to at least not have it enumerated inside of a county ordinance, which we've consented to.
Okay, so when it says shall retain the discretion, that includes any number of things, and one of those things is to not reduce the levy.
No, the levy is getting reduced based on the first sentence of this paragraph. So upon passage of the law enforcement retail activities tax, as in the voters voted in, and it's already gone through its 2 readings, once the voters voted in, then the city council is going to reduce the property tax levy from $1.79 to 79 cents in the next budget cycle or before or after. Now, if we're taking into account that the levy is expiring in 2024, is that right? That wouldn't make sense for city council to reduce the levy after that point in time, especially if you see the sales tax bringing in enough money to cover law enforcement objectives and operations. But I don't believe the way that this is drafted is, it doesn't create a conflict. It says what council is going to do on the front end and what council has the discretion to do later in the future.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm clear, I get the first part, but the part that says shall retain the discretion to make any necessary budgetary adjustments other than reduce the levy? So reducing the levy is not a part of that last statement. Like, you're talking about other budgetary adjustments, not the levy with that?
So are you asking, just to make sure I'm understanding your question, when it said the last sentence, the city council shall retain the discretion to make any necessary budgetary adjustments to ensure appropriate city law enforcement funding, are you asking if that does not include increasing the levy down the line?
I'm asking if that includes not reducing the levy by $1. If council so chose, if we were in a situation where there was a budget issue, would that clause give us the ability to not reduce the levy by $1 as it says above?
I think that it doesn't. I think that the first sentence says how much the levy is going to be reduced by. The last sentence says what council can do after the levy has been reduced from $1.79 to 79 cents.
So would you say the second sentence, or the final sentence there, doesn't override the first?
No.
Okay. I think that's been his concern, is that, or let's say we did initially reduce it from 179 to 79. You realize that the sales tax revenue falls, woefully short of that $1, and we needed to increase it back to $1.10.
Right.
Could we do that?
Yes.
Okay, which would then be overriding the initial intent of reducing it to 79. So it does give that flexibility.
Yes, but you would have that flexibility on your own anyhow.
Okay, for one year or whatever. Valerie and then Rick.
I just want to remind everybody that there are 8 counselors, that it's not like a council is going to zip in here and do something. I mean, I think the purpose of this is to say that we are committed that if the public agrees to accept the sales tax, that we are making the commitment to lower the levy, because that will unburden them, which is what our goal in stabilization of our public safety is. Now, back in 2010 or 2012, when there was an emergency situation and we had no jail, they reacted and they put a jail tax on because they needed to. And that is what the council's job is our number one job is to keep the public safe. And if an emergency comes up, there are 8 council to have this discussion to say, what are we going to do in this situation? That is what we're elected for, to make those hard decisions. And so I think we could sit there and go, if, there's a million ifs. But I think that the whole purpose of this is just to say, hey, We understand that this is the choice of the county to go for the seasonal sales tax. It will raise money within the city. We're just saying we're committed to lowering the property tax. We don't know what it's going to bring in exactly, and nobody knows exactly what it's going to bring in. And all we can do is do the best we can, but we also do have to retain the ability in an emergency situation to step to the plate to keep our citizens safe. And so, to me, I think this discussion just shows an incredible amount of distrust, and that saddens me, because I don't think that the whole purpose, we have 8 commissioners, council people, is that, we will ultimately work for the benefit of our constituents. So that's why I think that's the emergency clause that you need, because that is our #1 job. We've seen it happen in the past, and if it needs to happen again, we will rise to the occasion to do whatever we need to do to keep our citizens from an emergency situation. So, anyway, that's my thoughts. I think we're just running in circles right now.
Okay, other questions? You have a question, Rick? No?
I have a comment, but not a question.
Okay, are there other questions about this? I think we're just kind of interrupted Augustus in the middle of the presentation here. Okay,
It's all good.
go ahead and we'll do our discussion at the end.
Okay, and so moving down to the explanatory statement, the part that's highlighted is talking about what the city is going to do with its levy. This measure would direct the Grants Pass City Council to reduce its existing public safety levy from $1.79 to 79 cents per $1,000 of assessed value for taxes beginning on July 1st, 2024. That's the beginning of the budgetary period. Are there any, now in the language of the ordinance it says, or at any other time to be determined by council. Is council okay with this language in the explanatory statement? And if so, I'll let the county know. If not, I'll address it with the county before they finalize this language on Wednesday.
Concerns about the explanatory statement? Brian?
Well, if the statement says we're going to reduce it on July 1st, 2024, and the ordinance says next budget cycle or at any other time to be determined by council, I would feel more comfortable if the ordinance just said it'll take effect in the next or in the following budget cycle, like it says in the statement, so that they're consistent. So I guess that's more of a comment.
So the ordinance language itself has been finalized. The second reading has taken place. So we would be making this change in the explanatory statement. So if I'm understanding your concern correctly, I think that where you're going is you want to put in or at another time to be determined by the city council or something to that effect. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So then if that's the consensus of council, we'll just add to the end of this sentence, beginning on July 2024, comma, or at another time to be determined by city council.
Council discussion on that idea? Rick?
I'm in support of retaining, as it stated, 2024, because that's a commitment. And as long as I'm sitting here, as long as the sales tax passed, I would still be supportive of that. Thank you.
Valerie?
I have a question about that, is that during the budgetary process is when we really set, it's actually during May when we set the budget for the following year, am I correct?
Right.
And so I guess that's where I'm a little bit confused, because I just, here they're talking about budgetary, and here it just says 2024. So I guess that's what I want clarity on.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
Excuse
so
me.
maybe JC. Yeah.
I think that's supposed to read 2023, because that would be the next budgetary cycle right after the November election.
Okay, that's what, yeah.
Well,
Okay, so your question about the beginning of the budgetary cycle versus putting in the date.
Yes.
So, And I think that this was a consideration when drafting the language, where there wasn't a date in there. So that's another thing to consider. We can just have the county take the date out and basically mirror exactly what the ordinance says at the beginning of the next budgetary cycle, or at another time to be determined by council. Based on their word total, it looks like we can add that information in there and take out the date.
So for JC, is that because the sales tax would begin being collected in April, but I don't know when we would actually realize it. At what point would it make sense for us to drop the levy?
I think it could go a couple different ways. So if you wanted to give that absolution of it actually dropping $1 upon passage, you could leave July 1st, 2023 in there. The levy ends as of 2024. So in theory, you may not even go back out for another levy, which would be basically the dropping the levy to zero. So there's a couple different, I guess, manners and ways we can do that.
And in clarification, that would be something that would be discussed during the budgetary process, correct?
Correct, but I believe in the previous discussion, the intent of doing the dollar, and for transparency, it was going to be, if it passed, that it would be for the next budget cycle, and we would under levy underneath the $1.79 that we have approval for.
Right away through, but then it would be discussed again in May. And so it started, that's what I'm trying to figure out. So if it starts in April, it wouldn't be really until the following May. I'm just trying to figure out how that all works together with it. So help me with that.
Yeah, so we would start those discussions, but based on the language, you could basically make an action before we even get to those budget discussions with how this reads.
And I think that was going into my discussion about the council's power to underlevy. That's something that council can do on its own at any time. And the rationale for putting the $1 reduction that's so explicit in the ordinance was to have the public understand that that would be the result if they pass this tax. But the council, city council retains the discretion to underlevy at its discretion.
All right, I think I get it.
Well, I guess I would encourage you, the reason why you're including this is part of the sales pitch to the voters, and so I would encourage you to put a firm date and at the earliest possible that makes sense without leaving ourselves with a revenue hole. And it seems to me like July 1st, 2024 is awfully far away.
So I'll arrange to have that change made, and then pursuant to Councilor DeLagrange's request, I'll also put or at any time to be decided by council, so it mirrors the language in the ordinance, if there's consensus for that.
Is that what you'd like to see happen? Go ahead, Rick.
So I'm in favor, and you've already stated, the council still retains the discretion to make necessary budgetary adjustments, and I'm comfortable with that statement. What I'm not sure I am comfortable with adding discretion on the dollar.
So it wouldn't be adding discretion on the dollar. It would be adding the discretion on the timing of the levy reduction. So right now it says July 1st, 2024, meant to be 2023, or at a time to be determined by the city council. If you want, we can make it specific to before that date, or you can make that as a policy prescription on your own without putting that in the explanatory statement. But it's not discretion about the dollar reduction. It's discretion about the timing that the underlevy is to take place.
I guess I would like to hear what other councilors have to say, but I would be in favor of 2023. Thank you.
Anybody else want to chime in?
I need to read it and give
Okay.
myself a chance to really understand it before I speak.
Give you a minute to think about it. Oh, Rick, go ahead.
Is this time for discussion or just still questions?
We can have other discussion, yeah.
So I like some of the comments that Valerie has expressed previously, just confirming the language in here, and it's the way I understand it as well, that whether we're the sitting council now or in the future, the council still retains the discretion to make budgetary adjustments if necessary to balance the budget. And I guess if I'm sitting here and I'm looking at the budget next year, I want to make sure we have a safe city and that our budget is balanced as well. But to have a safe city, you also have to have funding. And the council has the discretion to make sure we have the income for that funding. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
So you're wanting to leave it at 2024?
No.
No. Both you and Valerie are wanting to change it to 2023?
2023.
And I think that actually just putting that and making that one change is, I think, all we need to do, because I don't think anybody's going to go back and compare the budget. I think it basically that says it. I don't think we need to put in the other part and change it to be redundant in the explanatory system to copy what we have up here. I think it basically says, by changing it to 2023 and leaving the ordinance the same, I think is fine.
Joel, go ahead.
Well, I appreciate everybody's discussion and everybody being engaged. Great discussion. One of the things that I had to ask myself, we can't adjust the property tax rate until we know how much revenue the sales tax is bringing in.
Well, you
And
already
so-
voted last week, Joel, on the dollar, so you were one of.
Well, I understand that. I understand that. But if people were going to adjust it and exercise that discretion, I guess you could start out with the dollar like we did. And there's some risk associated with that, obviously. Not a whole lot because of our sensitivity analysis. But we wouldn't really want to adjust any of that until we know what the sales tax was bringing in.
Right, and at this point, the ordinance wording is complete, so it includes the $1.79 to 79-cent change, but we're just able to have some influence over the wording of the explanatory statement. Which has two different parts that we're discussing. One is whether or not to leave that date 2024 or change it to 2023. And then the other part, we could add a clause that says, or at any other time to be determined by the city council, which would mirror what's in the ordinance. Augustus.
To make it clear for council, I'm pretty sure that June or July 1st, 2024 is a typographical error. And I believe that it was council's intention to start it for the next budgetary cycle. So I believe that's a change that needs to be made anyway.
Okay. Do you have further thoughts, Joel?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, Brian?
So if it's changed to 2023 and we reduce it, at that point, we're not going to know what the sales tax revenues are. So we're going to be reducing it before we even know what it's bringing in. So we're just going to be kind of adrift until we see what happens.
Yes, they already agreed last week to reduce it by $1.
Yikes, okay.
All right, well, it sounds like Rick and Valerie are supporting changing it to 2023, and Augusta says it should have been 2023 anyway, so let's make that change. Brian?
Yeah, I just have one other comment. It doesn't mirror our ordinance. It doesn't, no, this is our ordinance. It doesn't accurately reflect the language that we put in our ordinance. It says that we're going to reduce it in 2023, but our ordinance that we approve says, or at any other time determined by council. So leaving that out, if people go and look at the ordinance, it's not going to be the same as what's in the statement. So it's not consistent. I just wanted to put that out there.
That is something to consider for council. Mm-hmm. However, it is not our ordinance. It is the county's ordinance that we've consented to. There's a distinction. However, Councilor DeLagrange's point is a valid one. If, and this is really up to council. For the explanatory statement, if you wanted to add the language that says council shall, or at any other time to be determined by council, that's what the ordinance actually says. Now, the explanatory statement doesn't need to mirror exactly what the ordinance says, but it needs to give a concise statement of what it is. As it stands, it is a concise statement of what the ordinance does say. However, adding what Councilor DeLagrange is suggesting to the explanatory statement would not harm or hinder it wouldn't harm or hinder council's efforts.
Okay. So, such levy reduction shall take in the following budget cycle.
I don't know. Do you guys, Joel has his hand up. Go ahead, Joel.
Well, I appreciate Brian bringing that up, and I agree with him.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, back in reading it, I guess I have to put myself on the timeline basis of understanding that measure with direct existing on July 2023. So that's July. Next April, May will be our next budgetary cycle. So when we go into the next budgetary cycle in April, May, we really won't know what the effect of it's going to be. So I'm just trying to put myself in the timeline to understand where we're at. So if we don't know, then let's go back and read this. Such levy shall take effect at the following budget cycle or at any other time to be determined by the city council. The city shall retain the discretion to make any necessary. I mean, I'm I guess open to put it in there. I just don't want to weaken. But if that's going to help and make sure that we can be consistent, then I would be okay with putting it in there.
What about you, Rick?
As Valerie said, if that makes it more consistent, my only hesitation is I want to say you burden the language that's there. It makes it more confusing for the people. And I think the people that have elected us and exhibited trust in our decisions and how we take the city forward. And I think they realize we have some discretion. So I guess I'm in favor of leaving the language as it is without adding that on there. But if that gets more on board, I can accept it as well. Thank you.
All right, Rob, I'm going to have to call you out. Sorry, we've got 3 people in support of adding it in and 1 against. What do you think?
I don't want to from the beginning I've on these discussions I wanted to allow the people to vote on this issue. Beyond that, I think that almost any and everything to do with this, how the details of how this has played out, I've wanted nothing to do with and would have voted no on. But again, I don't want to have a no vote by me prevent this from the people deciding. So as far as moving this forward, or moving the date to 23, you could make the case that people should trust the council and so forth, but you could also make the case that making this as accurate as possible might increase the public's trust and the public will be able to find less holes in the argument, and as a result, trust the council more. If there's inconsistencies in here, then it's just more reason for the public to distrust us and the process. So I would actually like to make this as consistent as possible if I was going to go there, because I think it would probably, for better or for worse, it may contribute to the public wanting to vote no on it. But I also think that being as consistent as possible is probably the best policy.
All right, thank you. We've actually, DJ has joined us several minutes ago. DJ, to catch you up, we're on Exhibit C, which is the explanatory statement for the voters pamphlet, and it's already been determined that the year where it says July 1st, 2024 should have been 2023. So that's been changed. But the question we're discussing is whether to add or at any other time to be determined by the city council, which mirrors the language of the ordinance. And so far right now we have 4 people who are in support of adding that, and 1 who is not, because it does make it somewhat more, it's more consistent, but also a little more confusing. Go ahead, DJ.
Yeah, thank you for catching me up to speed. So the discretion on council for time, is this more of a consideration of 2023 being the earliest time of implementation, or is this basically leaving it open for any time?
No, it would state that that the levy would be reduced beginning July 1st, 2023. And then the clause would... And then the clause would be...
I apologize.
I think he sneezed.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry for joining late. What were you saying, Sarah, the clause?
Okay, so it would state that the levy would be reduced July 1st, 2023. And then we're just discussing whether or not to add or at any other time to be determined by the city council, because that is what's in the ordinance. And so some people feel that, having it in the ordinance but not in the ballot statement might cause some voter mistrust.
Okay, thank you for catching me up.
I just want to add something that I think if you're going to add that, you should also add the city council shall retain the discretion to make any necessary budgetary adjustments to ensure appropriate city law enforcement funding. Because I think those two go hand in hand. The only way we do it is if we didn't have enough money come in and we were in a bind. So if you're going to add or at any other time to be determined by the city council, that says, oh, gee, we want a new swim pool, let's just do that. But if you add to that, the city council shall retain, in order to retain the discretion to make any necessary budget adjustments to ensure appropriate city law enforcement funding, it kind of gives you that. So that's adding 32 words. And I think right now we have, what was it?
Oh, there's more than 100 to work with.
Yeah, so I think that we could do that and add the 2 of them, because that's, to me, if you just add, oh, it's at our discretion to do whatever, but I think the only reason that we would do that is if, honestly, we were in a crunch and we needed the law enforcement in our community. So I think if you're going to add 1, you add them both, and that's what I'm most comfortable with.
Okay. So you're proposing that we take this phrase from the ordinance starting at or at any other time and just go all the way through the end?
Yes, and that comes to 32 words, I believe.
Brian?
I would be fine with that.
Anybody have an objection? Rob says he's okay with it. DJ says he's good with it. Okay, let's do that then.
So I'll discuss this with legal counsel. Like I said, county is finalizing this language on Wednesday, so we should have more than enough time to get this taken care of.
Okay.
Okay. And so, yeah, based on Councilor Lovelace's proposal, we should do a motion for this as well, since it's going to be changing language of the
Go
explanatory
ahead and have a
statement.
vote on it. Okay. Val, you want to make the motion?
Yes, I make a motion in the explanatory statement for the voters pamphlet to add on the words, or at any other time to be determined by the city council, period. The city council shall retain the discretion to make any necessary budgetary adjustments to ensure appropriate city law enforcement funding.
Second from Rick, thank you. Any discussion? Or Val, how do you vote?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Rob?
Yes.
Brian?
Yes.
DJ?
Yes.
Joel?
Yes.
All right, motion passes 6-0. Thank you. On this same topic, I wanted to let you know if you're planning to write a letter of support for the voters pamphlet, the deadline is Friday. So if you would like to take a vote of the council and see how many councilors are in support of that endorsement, we could do that on Wednesday. Is that right, Augustus?
For counselors and for individuals who are wanting to put pro or for or against arguments in the pamphlet, the deadline's actually August 30th.
Oh, I thought this is what we just talked about.
Yeah, the August 19th deadline is for governments to put their explanatory statement ballot measures in the voters pamphlet.
Okay. Thought I had clarified that last week. So you have until August 30th, but I think we do need to have a vote if you want it to be an endorsement by the city council.
Yes.
So we'll need to get that on the agenda at some point before the end of the month.
Okay.
But we could do that at a workshop or business meeting. We just need to cross our...
There will not be another meeting before September, so it would have to be at a workshop.
Do
you
you
do it on a
have,
workshop?
yeah, unless you wanted it on Wednesday.
Yeah.
So I don't know where you're at in that process, just giving you a heads up that you need to have a council vote on that, because I'm not sure how many councilors are actually supportive of that. Okay, new topic. Actually, totally new topic, because we learned last week about a grant opportunity. So JC is going to discuss that regarding the warming center.
All right, just want to apologize. This is not normally how we bring these forward, but this is kind of on a time crunch, and I'll kind of show you what that looks like and why we're bringing it to this workshop. So we do have a time-sensitive grant opportunity. The relationship to council goals is to facilitate sustainable, manageable growth. Objective 2, encourage an environment which provides for the growth of affordable housing opportunities for the variety of grants pass residents' needs. And action 2, develop transitional housing. And so a little bit of the background here. September 23 of 2022, without funding, Rogue Retreat will cease to operate the emergency shelter at 711 Southwest Ramsey Avenue. April 1 of 2023 through March 31st, 2024, All Care Community Foundation, Rogue Retreat, Caros, and All Care Health are partnering for a one-year grant application through the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Human Resource and Service Administration that would improve health to underserved communities and populations, much like the emergency shelter. You can see there's about a 6-month gap in there, which would go through the winter months. And so to help bridge the gap, the City of Grants Pass is eligible to apply for funding from ODHS as a local government. Nonprofits and private organizations are not eligible for this grant. There is no cost implication to the city, as this is going to be a direct pass-through. The potential monthly costs for the emergency shelter are about $39,000, and the ask for the grant would be about $31,500 for 6 months for $189,000 as far as grant awards, and then All Care Health can offset the remaining costs as they have an agreement right now with Rogue Retreat. There is no timetable for ODHS, making it kind of a pressing issue of award, meaning on their website it doesn't tell us when they're going to award the grant funds, and it looks like it's potentially a first come first serve basis as well. So getting that thumbs up from you today would help us submit this in a time sensitive manner, because the next meeting, as you pointed out earlier, is until September 7th. And that would put that 2-week time crunch on when Rogue Retreat would be closing their doors on September 23rd. And so within this grant, there's another opportunity too. There's an air scrubber available. Now, what is an air scrubber? An air scrubber cleans smoky air at emergency shelters. So this is just a piece of equipment that the city would own, operate, and manage. And we'd be able to designate which shelter gets us in the future, depending on if this grant goes through or not. And so the call to action would be today, provided approval for submitting the grant application for the operation of the emergency shelter and air scrubber equipment. You do have some alternatives. We could just submit for the air scrubber, and then you can also not authorize the grant application. And I have some backup here if we have any detailed questions.
Thank you. Council, any questions? Rick, go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. On slide number 4, the 39,625. That's it. How much of that is employee cost or personnel cost, and are there numbers, and what does the breakdown of that monetary figure show?
I just turned it off. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So they are only asking for the staffing cost. So those costs are for staff, because they keep it open 24/7.
And staff is probably there less than 8 hours at a time, so are we talking 2 people or 20 people, or what does that look like?
I do know currently probably a third of that cost is hiring a temp agency to help make sure all the shifts are covered. So the breakdown by hour, I cannot tell you. I don't know that. I just had a budget that showed monthly expenses. It didn't tell me how many employees.
Do I remember from before there was 2 people per shift?
That sounds accurate.
Okay.
But Amber, do you know? Yeah, it's at least 2. So
2
no one's
people,
alone.
and I think there's, so is the shelter now 24 hours?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So that's 3
So
shifts.
probably 8-hour shifts normally, or maybe less.
It's 3, because the swing shift I know is from 4:30 to midnight, so.
Okay. Then last question. The slide before number 3 refers to All Care, Rogue Retreat, Kairos, and All Care Health. Are those entities, not good choice of words, still talking to each other, and they do have an agreement, so they are able to function? If the grant comes in, it still goes to those organizations?
Yes, they've been meeting like every other Thursday together, and they have All Care has been working with Kairos to ensure that they'd be able to continue the lease.
Okay, thank you.
DJ?
I think this is great, because I think we can understand that this something that we desire in this community. I have a concern that, this will nudge the city in the direction of being a operator, manager of a warming shelter. Is that a possibility with this kind of grant?
No, so our only involvement is that we are the only eligible entity, and it would just be the money would come into us and we would pass that straight along. We would have no desire to basically have any operating input.
Aaron.
Thank you for that clarification. I think this is a no-brainer. Thank you.
So just to add to that, Counselor, what JC mentioned is this would be, as an analogy, something very similar to what we do for the Transit Authority, where we are an entity that applies for a transit grant. We don't own or operate or have any responsibility for the transit system, but because we are a municipality and have availability to request funds, we then are a pass-through. So this is very similar to that type of grant program and partnership that we would have with the Transit Authority.
Valerie?
Yeah, it looks to me like, because I would really like, with everything else going on, I would like to have something functioning. So this emergency shelter, I think, is important. Is that $189,000 include the air scrubber?
That does
so
not.
That's $189,000 plus the cost of the air scrubber, and the air scrubber is the city's own. Okay, so I'm just going to clarify. So basically, these organizations have applied to get a grant that will move will start from April and go through the following March. But between September and April, that's what we're requesting. We're going to get the funds to pass through so that the current emergency operation that is all weather, smoke, whatever, will remain open throughout the year, and there's not that stop, correct? Okay.
That is the intent, yes.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted that clarification. So, no, I'm in favor.
Joel?
Yeah, thank you. Good comments. I know it's the highest priority of those four nonprofits to get that back online and keep it on, well, it's online, to keep it online. The one question I had, they're having some financial difficulties. They're losing some staff. We wish them the best. They do a good job. We haven't seen a business plan. If for some reason there are some financial difficulties there with the grant and they're unable to follow through with it, what is the city's liability?
Well, just like any other grant opportunity, if the funds cannot be spent, they would go back to the entity that gave us the grant.
Okay, and then the other thing, is a very similar question. If there's a violation of federal law with civil rights, what is the city's liability associated with that?
Yeah, so we would be subject, and Augustus can probably chime in here, but we would be subject to all federal and state regulations for any grant passer that we'd be doing.
Yeah, sorry, Counselor, just to add to that, since we're a pass-through, it would be on the organizations that are going to be using the money to use it in accordance with all federal regulations in conformance with all applicable laws. So as the pass-through, that wouldn't be our role, since we aren't taking on an organizational or operational stance for something like this.
Okay. Well, then it's a good go. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, no more questions. Discussion? Brian?
I assume we need a motion.
Yes, we need a motion to authorize the
Okay.
staff to move forward with the application.
Okay, I move to give approval for submitting the grant application for the operation of the emergency shelter and air scrubber equipment.
Second from Val, thanks. Any discussion? Check on my remote. Okay, No discussion, so Brian, you made the motion, how do you vote?
Yes.
Valerie?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Rob?
Yes.
Joel?
Yes.
DJ? DJ, are you still there?
Okay.
All right, he may have stepped away. Motion passes 5-0. All right, next up, agenda review. And we have a couple of motions you should have on the dais there from the Hbsc, just to give you a heads up about regarding some downtown efforts. One is that they had a motion to communicate to the council that they would like to see the Downtown Welcome Center be brought back to the original design of the building, which was the Ben Franklin Bank. And that if any doors, including garage-style doors, are to be added, it's the preference of the Hbsc that they be added to the west side of the building where a larger public gathering area exists. So that would be on the back side, closer to the plaza. Second motion is to recommend preserving the integrity of the very successful historic district, and they do not recommend moving forward with proposed changes to G Street. So those issues are going to be coming back up before you. I don't think we need to specifically add these to the agenda because we will be having a recommendation from the Downtown Task Force coming up within a few weeks here, or a month or so anyway, regarding downtown changes. And then we also still have to come back at that Welcome Center design another time. We do have a meeting I'm back up on the schedule here now. Wednesday night, we have a meeting with a public hearing. There's an ordinance to vacate a property line on Rogue River Highway. There's a council action item that would approve a BRAG grant. There is a couple of consent calendar items. One is a resolution on the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act program, and the other is a motion to approve findings of fact. And I don't remember what the topic was that were findings of fact about, but do you remember, Brad, or? The zoning. Oh, okay, a follow-up to the public hearing on medical marijuana. Okay. And then appointing a member to the Hbsc. Should be a fairly quick meeting. Any questions about that one? All right, and then next Monday's workshop is, hopefully we can, did we get the guests that we were going to invite, Aaron, for the homeless shelter discussion? Is that firmed up for next Monday?
I'll have to check with staff to determine that.
Okay. Well, we have not received, any formal presentation on the shelter that we were just discussing for that past grant application, but we were going to invite the organizations that are running the shelter on Ramsey, as well as Foundry Village, and just get you an update on how those projects are going, and then have a discussion about where you want to go from here regarding homeless shelters. Then an update on the Allen Creek Road rezone and an executive session with litigation. Any questions? Brian?
Yeah, on the item for Wednesday that talks about the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act program, I kind of am leaning towards making that a start item just because I have some questions about it, and I know now is not the appropriate time to bring those up, including the cost of applying for it, as well as the cost projections for the project itself. So I would like to star that, just so I can ask those questions.
Okay. DJ says that he can't hear the meeting. Is it muted? Okay. Okay, he's hearing us now. Maybe we're just in a pause, DJ. Okay, so we'll star that water infrastructure item for Wednesday. Unless you all have questions about anything else coming up, I was just going to remind you we're canceling the no meeting on the week of Labor Day, September 6th, and September 12th. We're talking about doing something kind of different on the September 12th workshop with kind of a special meeting with the building community to discuss what I would rather call, rather than the way it's written here, I would personally call it a discussion on barriers and incentives to facilitate multi-unit housing construction. And I wanted to see if Valerie was okay with that, because it was her idea.
Yeah, I think that's the purpose of bringing in the financing part of it, is to see what are the barriers that our builders have to building it, and what is there a possibility of getting rid of some of those barriers. So I would be fine with that.
Okay. Okay, well, that's tentatively scheduled for the 12th of September now. And is there anything else anybody wants to get added to the agenda coming forward?
Mayor, I just had a question from earlier conversation today. The law enforcement letter of support, did we decide, I didn't catch, were we going to put that on a Wednesday or a workshop to have that discussion?
No, it sounds like they have until the end of the month, so.
I have it written, and I wanted to wait until we had all of the explanatory and all that done to sit down and framework something, so I will start doing that now. But I don't think I'll have it ready for Wednesday's meeting.
Okay, I just wanted to check.
Yeah, I misunderstood. I thought the deadline was Friday,
Okay.
but that was for the explanatory statement, not the endorsement. A note on September 19th, it says advisory committee. That's the tourism advisory committee that we've kind of talked about what their role is going forward with, now that we have the DMO established, and what's the difference between the two. And also, yeah, the tourism lodging tax revenues, and on that same day. All right, Brian?
So one of the things we've been talking about is land banking with regards to housing. And I know that we've had some discussions about that before, but I'm not totally sure where we're sitting on that right now. Are we waiting for something to move the land bank topic forward, or are you waiting for council direction on that?
We can move that forward to a council workshop or further discussion. I think it might be timely in nature based on the previous direction from council when we had the housing authority and the council here. Council has directed us to go ahead and move forward with the allocation of $3 million to develop actually affordable housing projects through that partnership. That's the $2 million of ARPA for affordable housing. That's the $1 million for land bank. So we've got other opportunities of revenue to start a land bank program, like your CET or other things, or even some of the properties that we've sold and we have in supply dollars. So we should have a discussion ultimately about what type of land bank you're looking for, and really dial that in so staff will be very clear on how to move forward.
Okay. I would like to, at some point, get that on the agenda, if council agrees.
Yep, we do need to get that one back on. We have a couple of housing, obviously we had today's housing presentation The zoning transition overlay workshop will be on August 29th. DJ just had a question about that. And then, of course, September 12th also has to do with housing. So, but again, we do need to firm up what our program's going to be with those ARPA dollars. Clock's
I think
ticking.
also it would be nice to have clarity to know how much of the CET money has brought in through both the residential part of it and the commercial part, because I know that, that's something that, I would like, and I know that at one point in time the chamber asked for, if we had a plan on how we were going to spend that, and I don't know that we have anything specifically penciled into how we're going to spend that.
Well, yeah, you do have a CET program. You have identified in general categories of what that money, those resources can be utilized for. We can provide you with a memo on what we received today. It's been very short amount of time that we've actually been charging the CET, so it's not going to be a big number, but it'll give you an idea. If you'd like, we can submit a memo with that information.
And I would also like to have, along with that information, what amount of money that we have set aside from the sale of the properties. And I know, we talked about that being affordable, or whether that it has to be used in the same way as the CET. The CET is pretty well laid out how it has to be spent in terms of affordable housing, but I don't know if the other one previously was. So I think that knowing how much that is would help, and then having that discussion.
You're correct, Counselor. You do have more constraints with the CET revenue that you're receiving versus the sale of property that we've put aside for affordable housing. So why don't we put a memo together on affordable housing resources? We're talking about hard cash dollars that we have, and we'll provide you with where those funding streams are coming from, and potentially and link those funding sources to the potential uses.
That'd be great. All right, anything else for the moment? All right, how about a motion to adjourn? Brian?
I move to adjourn.
Second from Valerie. All in favor of adjourning today, say aye. Any opposed? All right. 2:34, resume your Monday, and we'll see you Wednesday night. Bye.